At first glance, the Arizona desert seems like one of the last places where abundant water could survive. Endless stretches of dry rock, towering cacti, and scorching summer temperatures define much of the landscape. Rain is scarce, rivers often disappear into sandy washes, and life has evolved to survive every precious drop. Yet hidden within a remote canyon lies a place that seems to ignore every rule of the desert. Crystal clear turquoise water pours endlessly through white limestone terraces. Waterfalls tumble over natural stone dams that continue growing year after year. Cottonwood trees shade cool pools filled with native fish, while birds, deer, and even black bears gather around a stream that never seems to run dry. This remarkable place is Fossil Creek, one of the rarest spring-fed river systems in North America. Unlike most rivers, Fossil Creek doesn't simply erode the landscape, it builds it. Every day, mineral-rich spring water deposits new layers of limestone known as travertine, slowly constructing natural dams, terraces, and waterfalls. Scientists estimate that the creek deposits several tons of limestone each day, constantly reshaping its own channel. The secret begins deep beneath Arizona's Mogollon Rim. Rain and snow falling on the high plateau slowly seep through thick layers of limestone. Some of this groundwater spends decades, or even centuries, traveling underground before emerging at fossil springs. When it finally reaches the surface, the water flows at an astonishing rate of roughly 20,000 gallons per minute, maintaining a remarkably constant temperature throughout the year. This consistency makes Fossil Creek extraordinary. Because the water originates from underground aquifers rather than seasonal rainfall, droughts have surprisingly little effect on its flow. Even during Arizona's hottest summers, the creek continues feeding its turquoise pools while much of the surrounding landscape dries out. The water also carries enormous amounts of dissolved calcium carbonate gathered during its long underground journey. As the spring water cascades over rocks and fallen branches, carbon dioxide escapes into the air. The dissolved minerals then solidify into fresh limestone, coating everything they touch. Over time, tiny deposits become terraces, terraces become waterfalls, and waterfalls reshape the canyon itself. Very few rivers on Earth are capable of building landscapes this way. Most rivers spend thousands of years wearing mountains down. Fossil Creek spends every day creating something entirely new. Its limestone has an even older story. The minerals moving through the creek today originally formed hundreds of millions of years ago, when much of present-day Arizona lay beneath a warm tropical sea. Countless marine organisms lived and died there, leaving behind shells rich in calcium carbonate. Over immense stretches of geological time, those ancient seabeds became limestone formations buried beneath the earth. Today, groundwater dissolves tiny amounts of that limestone before carrying it back to the surface. In a remarkable sense, every new travertine terrace forming in Fossil Creek contains material recycled from an ocean that vanished long before dinosaurs ever walked the earth. Early explorers misunderstood what they were seeing. Branches, leaves, and even fallen logs quickly became coated in pale limestone, giving them the appearance of ancient fossils. Believing the creek was producing petrified wood, they gave it the name Fossil Creek. The name remained even after scientists realized the process had nothing to do with fossilization. Instead, visitors were witnessing geology unfolding in real time, fresh limestone forming before their eyes. A living river literally constructing itself. For thousands of years, this extraordinary system remained largely unchanged, supporting an oasis unlike anything else in Arizona. Then, at the beginning of the 20th century, one engineering project would divert almost all of its water and transform one of America's most remarkable rivers for nearly a century. By the beginning of the 20th century, Arizona was changing rapidly. Mining towns were booming, new industries demanded electricity, and cities like Phoenix were growing faster than anyone had predicted. Copper mines operated around the clock. Smelters consumed enormous amounts of energy, and engineers searched across the territory for reliable sources of hydroelectric power. One place immediately stood out. Unlike seasonal desert streams, Fossil Creek flowed every day of the year. Its powerful spring-fed current and steep canyon created ideal conditions for generating electricity without the need for a massive storage reservoir. To engineers of the time, it looked like an opportunity too valuable to ignore. Construction began in the early 1900s under extremely difficult conditions. The canyon was isolated, with no modern roads connecting it to the outside world. Heavy machinery, steel, cement, lumber, and turbines had to be hauled across rugged mountains using hundreds of mules and wagons. Hundreds of workers labored in extreme desert heat to build what would become one of Arizona's earliest hydroelectric projects. In 1909, the Childs Power Plant officially began operating. Instead of storing water behind a large reservoir, engineers built a diversion dam near Fossil Springs. Most of the creek's flow was redirected into long wooden flumes and steel pipelines that carried water downhill to powerful turbines. After generating electricity, the water returned to the creek much farther downstream. From an engineering perspective, the project was a remarkable success. The consistent spring flow allowed electricity to be generated day and night, regardless of weather conditions. Within just a few years, the Childs Power Plant and later the nearby Irving Power Plant provided a significant share of the electricity powering central Arizona. Streetlights illuminated growing cities. Mining equipment operated around the clock. Businesses expanded. Modern infrastructure spread across the region. Few people questioned whether the benefits outweighed the costs. At the time, conservation was rarely part of engineering decisions. Rivers were viewed primarily as natural resources waiting to be developed. If flowing water could generate electricity, irrigation, or industry, putting it to work was considered progress. But while Arizona celebrated a new era of electrification, something remarkable was disappearing downstream. Nearly all of Fossil Creek's spring water was now bypassing the natural channel. The once powerful current that had built limestone terraces for thousands of years became little more than a trickle across much of the creek. Without enough flowing water, the natural formation of travertine slowed dramatically. The famous turquoise pools became smaller. Waterfalls lost much of their strength. Fresh limestone deposits nearly stopped forming. The river that had spent millennia building itself could no longer continue its work. The ecological effects spread far beyond the limestone. Native fish that had evolved in the warm, spring-fed waters suddenly found themselves confined to shrinking sections of habitat. Aquatic insects declined as the stream environment changed. Riparian vegetation struggled where water levels dropped, and invasive species found new opportunities to spread through the altered ecosystem. Yet for decades, few people realized what had been lost. The power stations became symbols of Arizona's industrial progress. Engineers praised the achievement, and the facilities eventually earned recognition as important landmarks in the history of American hydroelectric engineering. Meanwhile, the living river below quietly faded from public attention. For nearly 96 years, Fossil Creek remained only a shadow of its former self. Its springs still flowed beneath the diversion. Its ancient limestone still waited beneath the water. Its ecosystem survived, but only barely. Then, toward the end of the 20th century, something unexpected happened. The very company that owned the dam began asking a question almost no one expected. What if the greatest value of Fossil Creek was no longer the electricity it produced, but the river itself? By the 1990s, the hydroelectric system that had once transformed Arizona no longer held the same importance. When the Childs Power Plant opened in 1909, it represented cutting-edge technology. Its electricity helped power Phoenix, supported the booming copper industry, and fueled the state's early economic growth. But nearly a century later, Arizona's energy landscape had changed completely. Large coal-fired power plants, natural gas facilities, nuclear stations, and expanding transmission networks supplied almost all of the state's electricity. Compared with these modern systems, Fossil Creek generated only a tiny fraction of Arizona's power. At the same time, maintaining nearly century-old infrastructure was becoming increasingly expensive. Wooden flumes required constant repairs. Steel pipelines were aging. Hydroelectric equipment needed modernization. The entire project faced costly relicensing requirements under federal environmental regulations. Engineers realized that keeping the system operating would require millions of dollars in upgrades. But another conversation was taking place at the same time. Scientists had been studying Fossil Creek for years, and their findings painted a remarkable picture. They discovered that the creek wasn't simply another mountain stream. It was one of the largest active travertine-forming river systems in the United States. Very few rivers anywhere in North America continuously build limestone terraces the way Fossil Creek does. Its warm, mineral-rich water supported an ecosystem unlike almost any other in the Southwest. Biologists documented rare native fish found nowhere else in the region. The creek provided habitat for amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and hundreds of bird species. Its cottonwood forests created an oasis in the middle of Arizona's dry landscape. Researchers began asking a difficult question. Was producing a relatively small amount of electricity worth sacrificing one of the country's rarest natural ecosystems? Environmental organizations, government agencies, fisheries experts, and conservation scientists all reached similar conclusions. The river itself had become more valuable than the power it generated. Perhaps the most surprising part of the story is what happened next. No court ordered the dam's removal. No federal agency forced the company to abandon the project. Instead, Arizona Public Service, APS, voluntarily announced that it would decommission the child-serving hydroelectric system and restore Fossil Creek's natural flow. It was an extraordinary decision. Across the American Southwest, water rights are among the most valuable legal assets a company can own. Once water has been diverted for beneficial use, those rights are carefully protected. Giving up an established water diversion almost never happens voluntarily. Yet APS concluded that restoring one of Arizona's most remarkable rivers offered greater long-term value than continuing to operate aging hydroelectric facilities. The decision carried a significant financial cost. Removing portions of the diversion system, restoring the stream channel, and preparing the ecosystem for recovery required an investment of roughly $13 million. Not everyone supported the plan. Some questioned whether spending millions to restore habitat for a handful of native fish made economic sense. Others argued that preserving a rare geological and ecological treasure would benefit Arizona for generations to come. For the Yavapai Apache Nation, the moment carried even deeper meaning. Long before engineers arrived, Fossil Creek had flowed through their ancestral homeland. Ironically, many tribal members had worked on the original hydroelectric project nearly a century earlier, helping construct the very diversion that transformed the creek. Now, descendants watched as the river prepared to reclaim its natural course. During restoration ceremonies, tribal representatives spoke not only about history, but also about healing. Returning water to the canyon symbolized restoring a relationship that had been interrupted for nearly 100 years. Still, no one knew exactly what would happen after the water returned. Many scientists expected recovery to take decades. After all, the ecosystem had spent 96 years without its natural flow. Travertine formation had nearly stopped. Native fish populations had declined dramatically. Entire sections of the creek had been altered for generations. Conventional ecological thinking suggested that repairing such extensive damage would be a slow, gradual process. To answer that question, researchers began one of the most carefully planned river restoration studies ever conducted in North America. They measured everything before the water returned: water chemistry, insect populations, fish numbers, plant communities, and limestone growth, creating a scientific baseline unlike almost any previous restoration project. No one realized they were about to witness one of the fastest ecosystem recoveries ever documented. Years before the water was restored, scientists realized they had an opportunity almost no one in their field ever receives. Most river restoration projects begin after the damage has already been done. Researchers are forced to compare an altered ecosystem with historical records, photographs, or educated guesses about what once existed. Fossil Creek was different. Because the restoration had been planned years in advance, scientists could document the ecosystem before anything changed. Teams from universities, state agencies, and federal organizations spent years collecting baseline data. They measured water chemistry throughout the creek. They counted native fish populations. They surveyed aquatic insects, algae, and microorganisms. They recorded limestone growth, vegetation, and stream temperatures. Every detail was carefully documented, so they would know exactly how the ecosystem responded once the water returned. One major obstacle had to be solved first. During nearly a century of reduced flow, several invasive fish species had spread into parts of the creek. These non-native predators, including largemouth bass and green sunfish, fed on Arizona's native fish. Simply restoring the river, without removing the invaders, could have made the problem even worse. A larger river would give invasive species more room to expand. In 2004, nearly 100 biologists, fisheries specialists, students, and volunteers worked together on one of Arizona's largest native fish recovery projects. Using electrofishing equipment and carefully coordinated surveys, they removed thousands of invasive fish from the restoration area. At the same time, engineers built a permanent fish barrier designed to prevent those species from swimming back upstream after the river recovered. Only then was everything ready. On June 18, 2005, workers closed the diversion system for the final time. There were no dramatic explosions, no massive walls of water racing through the canyon. Instead, something much quieter and arguably far more remarkable happened. Water simply continued flowing where it had flowed naturally for thousands of years. For the first time since 1909, nearly the entire discharge from Fossil Springs remained in its original channel. Creek beds that had been reduced to shallow trickles slowly filled. Dry gravel bars disappeared beneath clear, mineral-rich water. Long silent waterfalls began flowing again. Pools gradually deepened as the current reclaimed channels that had been waiting almost a century. Scientists, conservationists, tribal representatives, and local residents watched from the banks. Everyone expected recovery. Almost no one expected it to happen quickly. Conventional ecological theory suggested that ecosystems damaged for nearly 100 years would require decades to fully recover. Habitats would slowly rebuild. Fish populations would gradually increase. Limestone terraces might take generations to begin forming again. That was the prediction. Reality turned out to be very different. Within weeks, researchers noticed changes that shouldn't have happened so fast. The water chemistry stabilized almost immediately. Algae and microscopic organisms responded with remarkable speed. Photosynthesis increased rapidly throughout the restored channel. The river's nutrient cycle, which forms the foundation of the entire ecosystem, began functioning almost exactly as it did in the untouched sections upstream. Instead of behaving like a damaged ecosystem struggling back to life, Fossil Creek acted like a healthy river that had simply been switched back on. The findings surprised even the scientists leading the project. Ecologist Jane Marks later described water as the ecosystem's master variable. Restore the natural flow, and many of the river's biological processes restart almost automatically. Then came perhaps the most astonishing observation of all. The travertine returned. Scientists watched fresh limestone begin coating rocks, fallen branches, and stream beds once again. New mineral deposits appeared within weeks. Over the following years, entirely new limestone terraces and natural dams formed throughout the restored channel. Researchers were watching a landscape literally build itself in real time. It was one of the clearest demonstrations ever recorded of geology operating on a human timescale. But the greatest surprise was still swimming beneath the surface. Native fish populations exploded far beyond what researchers had predicted. Species that had nearly disappeared suddenly spread throughout the restored habitat. Some populations increased dozens of times over within only a few years. The river wasn't recovering slowly. It was reclaiming its identity. As researchers continued monitoring Fossil Creek, the numbers became impossible to ignore. The recovery wasn't merely successful. It was extraordinary. One native species after another began expanding throughout the restored channel, often at rates rarely documented in river restoration projects. The Sonora sucker, a fish native to the Gila River basin, increased dramatically as clean, flowing habitat returned. The desert sucker, another species dependent on healthy streams, expanded even more rapidly. Perhaps most impressive was the recovery of the round-tailed chub, a native fish whose populations had declined across much of Arizona for decades. With flowing water restored and invasive predators largely removed, the species quickly reclaimed areas it had been absent from for generations. Then researchers turned their attention to one of the creek's smallest residents, the speckled dace. This tiny native minnow had survived only in scattered pockets during the years of reduced flow. Following restoration, its numbers increased dramatically. What had once been considered one of the creek's rarest fish became one of its most abundant. The results confirmed something ecologists had long suspected, but rarely had the opportunity to observe so clearly. Healthy ecosystems often recover from the bottom up. First came the microscopic algae and bacteria responsible for producing oxygen and processing nutrients. Then aquatic insects returned in growing numbers. Mayflies, caddisflies, stoneflies, dragonflies. These insects formed the foundation of the food web, providing food for fish, amphibians, birds, and countless other animals. As insect populations expanded, native fish followed. Soon afterward, larger wildlife returned to the canyon. Birds that hunted along the creek became increasingly common. The endangered southwestern willow flycatcher once again nested among recovering cottonwood forests. The common black hawk returned to hunt fish and amphibians. Black bears visited during Arizona's hottest months to drink and forage. River otters remained absent. They had disappeared from Arizona generations earlier. But nearly every other native species dependent on flowing water showed signs of recovery. Today, nearly 200 species of vertebrate wildlife use the Fossil Creek corridor. Perhaps even more remarkable was what researchers didn't find. Unlike many western rivers overwhelmed by introduced fish, Fossil Creek became one of Arizona's longest stream systems, supporting native fish without established non-native predators. That achievement alone made the restoration nationally significant. For scientists around the world, Fossil Creek quickly became far more than a local conservation success. It became one of the clearest demonstrations ever recorded that restoring a river's natural flow can rapidly restart an entire ecosystem. Researchers studying dam removal projects across North America now regularly reference Fossil Creek when discussing ecological recovery. The project showed that many damaged ecosystems are not permanently destroyed. Instead, they are often waiting for one essential ingredient to return: water. The findings influenced restoration efforts far beyond Arizona. As aging dams reached the end of their useful lives, conservationists pointed to Fossil Creek as evidence that rivers could recover faster than previously believed when natural processes were allowed to resume. Yet just as the creek began healing, a completely different challenge emerged. People. Photographs of brilliant turquoise pools spread across travel magazines, websites, and eventually social media. Visitors who had never heard of Fossil Creek suddenly wanted to experience it for themselves. Attendance increased rapidly. Thousands of people arrived each summer, then tens of thousands. Parking areas overflowed. Unauthorized campsites appeared. Visitors walked across fragile limestone terraces that had taken years to form. Some climbed waterfalls. Others left trash behind or damaged recovering vegetation along the stream banks. Scientists worried that the river faced a new danger, not from engineering, but from popularity. One researcher summarized the concern with a sentence that has since become closely associated with Fossil Creek. "We're afraid people will love it to death." The canyon had survived decades of water diversion. Whether it could survive overwhelming human attention became the next great question. Today, Fossil Creek looks almost unbelievable. Crystal clear turquoise water winds through limestone terraces that continue to grow year after year. Waterfalls cascade over bright white travertine formations. Native fish once again swim through warm spring-fed pools, and dense cottonwood forests provide shade in a landscape otherwise dominated by desert. But preserving that recovery has required a different kind of engineering. Instead of building structures to control the river, managers now focus on protecting the natural processes that brought it back to life. After the restoration became internationally known, visitation increased dramatically. Photographs of the creek spread across travel websites and social media, turning a once quiet canyon into one of Arizona's most sought-after outdoor destinations. During busy weekends, thousands of visitors attempted to enter the area. Vehicles crowded narrow forest roads. Informal trails cut through fragile vegetation. People climbed on newly formed limestone terraces, unaware that every footprint could damage formations that had taken years to develop. Unlike ordinary rock, travertine is still alive in a geological sense. Mineral-rich water continuously deposits fresh layers of calcium carbonate. Walking across these delicate surfaces can interrupt that process, break young formations, and slow growth that occurs only under very specific environmental conditions. Recognizing the danger, the U.S. Forest Service introduced a seasonal permit system. Visitor numbers are now limited during the busiest months of the year. Parking reservations help prevent overcrowding. Camping restrictions protect sensitive habitats. Rangers patrol the area, educate visitors, and enforce rules designed to keep the recovering ecosystem healthy. The goal is not to keep people away. It is to ensure that future generations can experience the same remarkable landscape without unknowingly destroying it. More than 20 years after the restoration, scientists continue returning to Fossil Creek. Long-term monitoring has shown that the river remains one of the most successful examples of ecological recovery ever documented in North America. Researchers still study travertine formation, groundwater chemistry, native fish populations, aquatic insects, and the complex biological interactions that make the ecosystem function. Every year adds another chapter to one of the world's best natural restoration experiments. The lessons learned here have influenced river restoration projects far beyond Arizona. Across the United States, thousands of aging dams have reached the end of their useful lives. Communities now face difficult decisions about whether to repair obsolete infrastructure or allow rivers to flow naturally once again. Fossil Creek has become one of the strongest pieces of evidence that restoration can succeed when natural systems are given the opportunity to recover. Its story has inspired similar efforts on rivers throughout the country, demonstrating that ecological damage is not always permanent. Sometimes the most effective solution is surprisingly simple. Remove the obstacle. Let the water flow. Allow nature to do what it has always known how to do. Perhaps the most remarkable part of Fossil Creek's story is that nothing about its recovery was artificial. Scientists did not rebuild waterfalls. They did not construct limestone terraces. They did not stock the river with millions of fish. Instead, they restored the one ingredient that had been missing for nearly a century: the creek's natural flow. Everything else followed. The limestone began growing again. The insects returned. Native fish multiplied. Birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians reclaimed the canyon. An ecosystem that had been suppressed for 96 years remembered how to function. That may be Fossil Creek's greatest lesson. Nature often possesses an extraordinary capacity for resilience. Given the right conditions and enough patience, it can recover in ways that exceed even the expectations of the scientists who study